So there's a lot of discussion currently about the Overtrigger and its issues in Vanguard. And I'm not here to discuss whether or not the Overtrigger should or shouldn't be in or out of any format, as there are a variety of videos and other posts online about that already. However, I did hear about an idea called the Wild Trigger that I thought was a really good solution to the Overtrigger. To start with an important point, replacing the Overtrigger with a new mechanic is the only real feasible way to remove it, in standard at least, as it can't be removed outright without some backlash. This doesn't necessarily mean from people who really like the Overtrigger, but more so from the shops that sell Vanguard at their stores. Different Fight explains the topic much more in this video he posted on the 27th, so I really recommend watching that. But essentially, if the Overtrigger is banned, then a lot of trial decks and such become invalidated products as it is no longer a legal and fully functioning deck. As such, a new mechanic needs to be introduced that would be so good that everyone would want to pick it over the Overtrigger, so that it could be functionally removed from the game without invalidating all of the product that shops invested money into. After hearing that is when I came across Soul Kage's tweet about something called the Wild Trigger, which Soul introduced as a mechanic that would have been cool instead of the Overtrigger at the start of Overdress. What this trigger does is that it would be a 1-of in the deck that, when revealed, acts as any trigger effect of the revealer's choice between a critical, front, draw, or heal trigger. It would still give 10k power and be removed on reveal, and have a 50k shield for when drawn. I thought this was a really cool idea and would have been really interesting to have instead of the Overtrigger. Having a trigger that is malleable based on the situation and can be a critical in a drive check or a draw on damage seemed like a great way to increase interactivity in the game too. But thinking about what Different Fight said in his video, I knew it wasn't the best solution since people wouldn't really pick it over the Overtrigger, since it has less benefit and is still just a 1-of. That led me to thinking, what if it wasn't? I thought that maybe if there could be multiple of this wild trigger in the deck, then the utility and consistency of this trigger could outweigh the potential benefits of the Overtrigger and just be a smarter choice for almost any deck in the format. That being said, what kind of parameters would this new trigger need in order to be able to be a better choice than the Overtrigger? And how many of it should we have? To start, I think having a trigger that we can make a 4 of to maximize the consistency of the trigger would be best, so that it can be a more consistent benefit as opposed to trying to compete with the raw advantage of the Overtrigger. This leads us to what the trigger effect should do. I think what would be best is still the base 10k power increase, with a choice between a critical, front, and draw effect. The original proposition by Soul Kage had a heal effect as well, but to have 8 potential heals in the deck would be a bit excessive. Another important point to note with the trigger effect is that there was the limitation on a max of 8 critical triggers per deck that was instituted a while ago, and these wild triggers could essentially function as 4 more critical triggers in a deck, making 12. So in order to increase the reality of this trigger becoming a real thing, in the event the idea intrigues Bushi, I think the critical trigger limitation should specify that only 8 cards that can administer a critical ability can be in a deck, as to keep that balance in place. As for the shield value, there is some slight wiggle room. If we were to take the net total guard of a set of triggers with the Overtrigger in place, assuming 4 heals, 8 critical, 3 draw, and 1 Overtrigger, that would come to 260,000 total guard, assuming effect draws. Now, a set of triggers with the Wild Trigger would include many similar triggers, being 4 heals, 4 critical, and 4 draw, now that the Overtrigger's out, and then 4 wild triggers. Excluding the wild triggers, the total guard comes to 160,000 guard. Now with standard 15k trigger guard, the wild trigger would increase it to 220,000 net guard. Although not awful in comparison, I think keeping them much closer would be better in order to maintain net guard value. This could result in 2 different guard values. One being the wild triggers having 20,000 guard, which would increase the net guard to 240,000, which is lower, but it also spreads the guard value around more as opposed to centralizing it in one card, which is also important to note. The other guard value we could have would be 25,000 guard, which would perfectly tie the net guard value of the trigger set with the Overtrigger, and also spreads the guard around. Due to many of the high power values in Overdress at the moment, The 25,000 power guard seems to be like the better option for the state of the game and doesn't lose out in comparison to the Overtrigger set either. That covers the main aspects of the trigger, being the trigger effect and the shield value. I think that there's really only one aspect of the card left that we need to consider, which is the printed power of the card. The Overtriggers have 5,000 power at the moment, and there isn't much need to alter that value since it won't have too significant an impact. But we do want the Wild Trigger to be considered a better alternative in pretty much every capacity. Now the card is essentially complete. There are more copies of it in the deck, which increase how often it will be seen and tailors the trigger effects to the situation so that no time is revealed will its effect be wasted. It also has high shield value to allow for more guard for some of the high power thresholds in Overdress, and is overall a much more interactive and adaptable trigger in my opinion. I would honestly play 4 of these in comparison to the Overtrigger any day of the week. Seeing 1 or 2 each game as opposed to the Overtrigger once every few, and when it does, have it activate at a suboptimal time, like on grade 2 for me since I play Keter. Plus, it removes the aspect of just simply winning 1 out of every 10 games just because you checked 1 card. It makes the game much more competitive again. Now, these wild triggers might not be as appealing in premium since there are a variety of effect triggers and such that might make it not as worth it to play them in premium. I can't say whether or not that's necessarily the case since I don't play premium that often currently, but I would imagine that the wild triggers might not have as much benefit in comparison to the Overtrigger, especially with how much more the decks can be manipulated in premium. And to that I say, at the end of the day though, these are just my thoughts, and I would love to hear what everyone else thinks. Do you think the wild triggers would be a great addition to Overdress with a choice restriction to the Overtrigger? Are there any things that should be added or taken away from the wild trigger to balance it out a bit more? Feel free to let me know in the comments, and I hope you all really enjoyed the video.